and studied it. And then later, in my background at Stanford, I studied computer science and worked at Apple and did user interface engineering and was really fascinated by human-computer interaction, which was my focus of discipline at Stanford. My advisor was Terry Winograd, who's a very famous AI researcher. He was also the advisor of Larry Page from Google. And so I was taking all these lessons of persuasion, psychology, perception. How does the mind work? How does the mind process information? How does that relate to how computing and technology influence phenomenology and the meaning-making systems that govern, our 24/7 experience of reality? And then it was really my senior year at Stanford, or actually my first year of my graduate program, that I took a class with Professor B.J. Fogg, who, as the film The Social Dilemma talks about, ran a lab called the Stanford Persuasive Technology Lab, in which he took everything we knew from the psychology of persuasion and influence. These are things like Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power, or Robert Cialdini's Influence book, how to win friends and influence people, slot machines, casino design, clicker training for dogs, things like this, and applying that to technology. How would you make technology influence our attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors? And it's so important to always anchor any of the issues that we want to accuse technology of causing in society. It's easy to talk about data or privacy or antitrust, or maybe it's not easy, but this is certainly the ones that dominate more public attention. But what often doesn't get nearly as much attention is just what is technology doing or influencing on us on a daily basis? How is it pulling the strings on the human psyche? And is it gaining a greater capacity to do that over time? And that really is the foundation of what the film The Social Dilemma was trying to unpack. And it's really the foundation of our work in the Center for Humane Technology, where the word humane is in reference to asymmetries of power, where there is a persuasive, strong influence effect of technology over us, and we have to identify what an ethical, asymmetric or persuasive relationship between technology and, the human psyche would look like.
So I know you've told the story 1,000 times, but can you briefly go over what you tried to do at Google and how it landed?
Yeah, so I was a technology entrepreneur. So first of all, I left Stanford. I started a tech company called Apture. I raised venture capital. I say this because I think oftentimes people hear about technology, critics of technology or social media who, they just don't understand, how we in the tech industry actually do things. And what was different a little bit about my story is I was friends with a lot of the people who built some of these products. In fact, when going to college with the founders of Instagram and starting a tech company myself and going through that process with many people of my cohort. That year, I'm the same age as Mark Zuckerberg, so a lot of people, my classmates, were going off to work at Facebook in the early days. And I say all that because when I landed at Google through the sort of failed, it was sort of a talent acquisition of our failed startup, they acquired us and my team. I became interested in what all of my friends I felt like were caught up in this treadmill, which was to sort of meet the venture capital goals of growing to 10, 100x of your users and getting to, lots of engagement, lots of time spent. And that I saw this kind of lie that we were telling ourselves in the tech industry that our mission was to make the world more open and connected. We can blah, 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 say what we want. That's what our stated mission or goal is. At the end of the day, the metrics that the engineers measured was really about engagement and time. So when I was at Google and I was a product manager on the Gmail team, I just became concerned with the industry more at large. It really wasn't just Google that I was concerned about. It was the industry at large. But here I was within, one of the largest, most influential tech companies on the planet, and I made a presentation that said never before in history have, 50 designers at a handful of tech companies basically determined the collective psyche, the collective attention economy that 2 billion people experience when they're jacked into our current, digital set of applications, social media, email, text messaging, etc. And that this was broadly downgrading or diminishing and degrading different aspects of social life, from trust to relationship quality to mental health to addiction and distraction, productivity, focus. And that presentation ended up going viral at Google, and I became a design ethicist, which I want to call out Google for generously giving me that space to do that work, because for about 2 to 3 years I was trying to change Google from the inside. I did ultimately leave, though, because I saw that in general the business model of the whole industry was in conflict with many of the things that that I was concerned about and was starting to write and speak about.
Yeah, that's something that hangs over the whole documentary and your work in general, which is the fact that a company that operates on an incentive structure that, as you often say, is selling our attention attention as the product because we nominally use these social media platforms for free. They actually don't have the incentive structure that makes it possible to reform themselves. And the analogy that really struck me, kept coming up while I was watching the documentary was just the analogy of food or candy companies. And I remember my mother growing up, she grew up in a very poor background in the Bronx. And she ended up escaping poverty and working at a marketing company at M&M Mars and was very high up. And one day she walked into the boardroom and they were speaking about where the metrics on the candy, on the Mars bars, or whatever they were selling in the 80s. And they said that they were very happy because they were, quote, over-indexing on kids from her neighborhood in the Bronx. And that was a point of celebration. And that's one way to frame it. Another way to frame it is we're selling a lot of candy to poor kids that aren't eating breakfast and aren't aware of the long-term ramifications of too much sugar consumption. And, it's akin to asking a company like that, which is filled with normal people, right? Not evil masterminds hell-bent on giving the world diabetes. But it's akin to asking them to regulate themselves and to try to voluntarily scale back this insane drug, called sugar. And so that analogy of sort of food and candy, it kept recurring to me while watching the social dilemma. Is that a parallel you think makes sense?
Yeah, in fact, deeply, because one of the books that I read early on in this work, I think it was like 2012 or 13, was Salt, Sugar, Fat by Michael Moss at the New York Times, where he talks about the history of the food industry basically as a game theoretic contest between who can basically more cleverly combine just three simple ingredients, salt, sugar, and fat, and that the more interesting, almost like we do, drug discovery in AI, where you have the AI sort of calculate new combinations of things to sort of figure out what kind of drugs would solve various health issues in society. This is sort of the opposite, where you have food companies figuring out, hey, can we actually change what's called the mouthfeel of Cheetos? Can we have it dissolve faster? Can that get people to eat more? Hey, if we mechanically tenderize meat, do people chew more of it and buy more McDonald's because half the chewing has been done by a machine tenderizing the meat for them before they eat it? And you end up with cereal where they combine different kind of elements together. And in general, it's this race to sort of reverse engineer the gustatory aspects of the human sort of nervous system to be maximally responsive. And much like in the attention economy, where there's a finite amount of attention that each of these companies in the digital sphere is competing for, can YouTube get the 30 minutes or can Netflix get the 30 minutes? In this case, in the food environment, there's a finite stomach share. We used to talk about the stomach share, and it's a win-lose game. So if they don't take it, the other guys will. And in fact, there was in this book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, documenting, I think it was either in the late 90s or might have happened twice, they had all the food companies gather in kind of a meeting that you're talking about, where they basically said, hey, can we regulate ourselves? Are we causing diabetes? They actually had food scientists talk about the trends of increasing diabetes, increasing obesity, and they said, we never roll in this. And there was an attempt to try to create almost like a Geneva Convention for putting caps on the amount of salt, sugar, and fat in these products. And in fact, one of the CEOs, it becomes a classic multipolar trap, where if I don't do it, the other guys will. And so it's a race for who has the least ethics, basically who's most sociopathic, who's willing to just simply do the thing that works at getting the kids to eat the Mars bars or whatever, or getting the teenage kids to addicted to looking at photos of their friends. And in the case here, I think it was General Mills, Betsy Hall, I can't remember the name of the CEO, but she put limits of the amount of salt, sugar, and fat in her food company. And they did that at the same time that their competitors' products actually increased revenues. Theirs flatlined. And there was literally documented in the book a call with the Wall Street analysts who said, hey, why is your revenue flatlining? And the CEO explained that they put in these limits for salt, sugar, and fat. They actually kicked out the CEO, removed the caps on salt, sugar, and fat, and went back to business as usual. And this is very reflective of what we're seeing in technology, where Facebook adopted this phrase, time well spent, which is some of
there's really no getting rid of this completely. Like it would be totally naive to think that we can get rid of social media. But it seems like what we've done with food is especially in the past, I think 20, 30 years, we've created a culture where it's known that candy is bad for you, where it's normal to set limits on how much you give to your kids, and just through the process of raising awareness, have built a culture that acts as a counterweight to our instincts here. And I think I sort of beginning to see that happening around technology. I have one friend who has some app on her phone that makes the whole thing black and white to be sort of less appealing. I'm sure you know of a lot of tools people are using like this. Are you have you been sort of behind the scenes of the creation of any of these kinds of things, or what can you tell my listeners about these kind of tools to save your attention?
Yeah, there's certainly a conversation about personal habits that we can all adopt, but I think I just want to zoom in first on the thing you said a second ago, which is that these parts of ourselves are not going away. Our attraction to salt, sugar, and fat are going to be there for the rest of time. As I remember talking to Sam on his podcast 4 or 5 years ago, saying, imagine you can beam enlightenment down into an ant body, and so the ant wakes up and its eyes sort of blow, open up, and it sort of has the knowledge of the universe. It has Einstein's theories of physics and everything, and it's still trapped in an ant's body. So if those pheromones come along, it's still going to do and want what an ant does and wants, right? And we're, I think, an interesting reflection of that same impulse. We have the primal lower level parts of ourselves. They're not going away. Tribalism is built into who we are. It's a survival mechanism. It's an adaptable mechanism. But you have technology that is weaponizing tribalism and replacing epistemology with, how do we know what we know, with tribalism, and that's been very, very toxic for our information environment. You have technology that's playing with our dopamine variable schedule rewards. That's the slot machine dynamic of if you pull a lever and sometimes you get a reward and sometimes you don't, and there's actually a time schedule, and the more variable the reward, both in magnitude and in terms of time, like when it comes back, the more addictive it is. That's all part of how the human mind and psyche sort of just fundamentally operate. The best we can do is become aware of it. And in fact, the kind of gift is that we're the only species that if we were to do something like this, where we created an environment that is entirely maladaptive, we're also the only species with the capacity to literally rip the screen off of our own operating system, point our intelligence back at ourselves and say, oh, there's facts about my own brain that I can sort of choose to make my environment work with those facts about how my brain works. And that's where technology is breaking down now, because your friend who's doing the black and white screen, they're effectively, because they know this knowledge about their brain and the colors, which are chosen by the way, the red is a trigger color, and that's why notifications are red, because they are faster at attracting your attention. I literally have a friend who has a big tech company that people would know. They tried changing their notification color to blue, and it didn't get nearly as many click-throughs as when it was red. And the point is that you're classically just trapped in this game of how the human psyche works. And if they don't do the red notification color and the other apps do the red notification color, then they're going to lose. So again, it becomes this multipolar trap where if I don't do it, the other guy will, which we'll probably get into is the root of so many problems that we're experiencing today, whether it's in food, autonomous weapons, climate change, right? It's just multipolar traps are everywhere. But again, we're the only species that can know this about ourselves. So I think the premise is not that we can get rid of the technology, or we can get rid of our desire for connection or social validation or tribalism. The question is, what is the healthy expression of those things? What is healthy tribalism? What is healthy social validation? What is healthy novelty seeking? And that's, I think, a conversation about what is humane to our own fundamental, weaknesses. So when it comes to tools, we can certainly talk about that. I'm not really an expert in all the various things, but I will say that the reason that Android phones, which is probably more than 1 billion phones out there, now automatically late at night shift into grayscale as you flip towards the later hours of the evening, is actually due to some of the advocacy that we've been pushing for many years. And so these digital well-being initiatives that Apple launched on the iPhone, where you have screen time management features, time limits for kids,